European imperialism in the 19th century spread across continents, from Africa to India, and it reshaped almost everything in between. Yet one region that is often forgotten in the grand sweep of this era is Central Asia. It is a vast land of deserts, mountains, and ancient cities that for centuries stood apart from both European and Asian empires. But in the 19th century, Russia turned its attention toward this region and began a long, determined and often brutal campaign that would eventually add more than 1,000,000 square miles of territory and millions of new subjects to the expanding Russian Empire. This is the story of how that conquest unfolded and how a region older than Russia itself came under its control. Central Asia had been home to organized civilizations long before the rise of the Russian state. The ancient cities of the Silk Road had flourished for centuries, and they had endured waves of conquest from Persians, Arabs, Mongols, and Turks. The arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century reshaped the region, and their legacy endured in the Turkic khanates that ruled its cities and steppes in later centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the region was divided among several powers. To the north were the remnants of the Kazakh Khanate, which had splintered into the junior horde, the middle horde, and the senior horde. Each consisted largely of nomadic or semi-nomadic Kazakhs, and each interacted regularly with the Russian frontier. Further south lay the three major khanates of the region, Khiva, Samarkand, and Bukhara. Bukhara had become an emirate in the late 18th century, and together these powers controlled the cities of modern Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan. Russia traded with them, but the relationship was unstable. Russian caravans were attacked, and Russian subjects were kidnapped and sold. These tensions and the ambitions of Russian rulers eventually pulled the empire deeper into Central Asian affairs. The era of Peter the Great marked the beginning of more aggressive Russian attention towards Central Asia. In 1717, he ordered an expedition led by Alexander Bekovich Cherkassky to campaign against the Khanate of Khiva. The Russian troops marched into Kievan territory, defeated their forces in open battle, and then entered negotiations, believing the conflict might be settled through diplomacy. The Kievan ruler Cherkassky appeared to welcome the Russians and offered to house their soldiers in several towns. Exhausted from the march, the Russians accepted. It proved to be a fatal mistake. Once they were separated into smaller detachments, the Kievans attacked and destroyed the Russian forces almost to the last man, including their commander. It was a disastrous betrayal, but Russia was too occupied with the Great Northern War in Europe to respond. Even after this disaster, Russia maintained an interest in Central Asia. In the mid-18th century, the Junior Horde and the Middle Horde accepted Russian suzerainty and became part of the expanding empire. This created a frontier that roughly resembles parts of the border seen on modern maps. The Senior Horde remained independent until it was conquered not by Russia, but by the Kokand Khanate in the early 19th century. Russia did not return to Central Asian military operations until the 1830s, when attacks on Russian traders again became a serious concern. Russian leaders believed that the Khanate of Khiva remained hostile and felt it was time to avenge the insult that had been delivered a century earlier. Count Vasily Perovsky, the governor of the Orenburg frontier, argued that Khiva was guilty of banditry, robbery, and calculated disrespect toward the Russian Empire. A military campaign was planned, but logistical difficulties delayed the expedition until 1839. Perovsky made a critical error by underestimating the Central Asian winter. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and Russian troops died in large numbers before they ever reached enemy territory. 1 in 5 Russian soldiers perished, and Perovsky was forced to abandon the mission. Despite this failure, Russia continued slowly to increase its influence in the region throughout the 1840s, and by the 1850s, renewed its ambitions. The Russian goal was to advance down the Syr Darya River and create a stable fortified frontier. Perovsky, who somehow kept his career after the disastrous Khiva expedition, was tasked with this effort. This time, the campaign was more successful. Russian forces seized the fortress of Akhmechet in 1853 after undermining its walls with explosives. This established a key foothold in the region. After this victory, Russian Attention was drawn away by the Crimean War, but forts continued to be built, and the frontier crept farther south. By the 1860s, Russia was once again focused on Central Asia, and several new factors encouraged their expansion. Russian leaders were increasingly concerned about competition with Britain, whose influence was spreading across South Asia and the Middle East. The two empires approached each other through their conquests, and Afghanistan lay between them. Economic motivations also played a role, as the American Civil War had disrupted global cotton supplies, and Russia saw opportunities to access Central Asian cotton markets. With these motivations in mind, Russia resumed its military advance. Russian forces captured key positions from the Kokand Khanate, including Yangi-Kurgan, Turkestan, and Chimkent. All these places were stepping stones toward the real prize, Tashkent. Tashkent was one of the largest, richest, and most influential cities in Central Asia. Capturing it would break the power of Kokand and cement Russian dominance. The first Russian assault in 1864 failed, but General Mikhail Chernyov returned the following year with reinforcements. The Kokand ruler attempted to meet the Russians in open battle, but was killed and his forces scattered. Russian troops stormed the walls of Tashkent, and after days of fierce street fighting, the city fell. The conquest of Tashkent was so unexpected and swift that it even surprised the Russian government, but they accepted the victory, and Chernyov was celebrated as the Lion of Tashkent. With the fall of the city, the power of the Kokand Khanate collapsed. Russia forced Kokand to surrender large territories to allow Russian traders access and agreed to annual tribute. Bukhara recognized the threat as well. Unable to match Russian artillery or organization, the Emirate of Bukhara attempted to seize disputed lands before Russia could consolidate, but they were decisively defeated at several battles. The Russians marched west and took cities such as Koyand, Uratayub, and Jizik. With Kokand humbled and Bukhara weakened, Russia formed a new governor-generalship centered in Tashkent under General Konstantin Kaufman. Kaufman would shape Russian rule in the region for the next decades. Kaufman soon led another major campaign, this time against Bukhara itself. The Russians captured the ancient city of Samarkand in 1868. Believing the Bukharan army to be in retreat, Kaufman pursued them, leaving a small garrison of only 700 men to defend Samarkand. While he was away, a combined force of more than 30,000 Bukharans and their allies stormed the city. The Russian defenders desperately fortified themselves in the citadel. Though heavily outnumbered, they held out for a week, and Kaufman returned in time to force the attackers to retreat. With its armies defeated, Bukhara submitted. Most of its territory was annexed, and the emir became a Russian protectorate, required to pay annual tribute and permit Russian merchants free access. Khiva remained the last of the major khanates still outside Russian control. Kaufman planned a large and coordinated invasion. Multiple Russian columns advanced from different directions in 1873. Yet the Khivan leadership had seen the fate of Kokand and Bukhara and offered only limited resistance. The Khivan Khan soon surrendered and became another protectorate, required to pay indemnities and follow Russian direction in external affairs. But Kaufman and the Russian commanders wanted a final demonstration of imperial power. They targeted the Yomid Turkmen, who had offered some resistance. In a brutal 3-week campaign, Russian troops burned villages and killed large numbers of Turkmen civilians. Even Kaufman later admitted discomfort with the scale of the violence and omitted these events from his official reports. Rebellion flared again in Kokand in 1875. Discontent with the Khan, who had submitted to Russia, led to a popular uprising. Kaufman crushed the rebels at the Battle of Andijan, and Russia abolished the Khanate entirely, incorporating its lands directly into the empire. Only the Turkmen of the Karakum Desert remained independent. They had no unified leadership, but they were fiercely determined to resist. In 1879, they defended the fortress of Tepe and inflicted heavy losses on Russian troops, forcing them to retreat. But in 1880 and 1881, a second larger Russian army returned. After a long siege, the fortress fell, and as many as 15,000 Turkmen were killed. With this defeat, the last major resistance in Central Asia collapsed. Russia took the ancient city of Merv in 1884, and the conquest of the region was essentially complete. The one remaining question was where Russian authority would end and British influence would begin. The two empires nearly came to war in 1885 over the Panjshir region, which was claimed by both Russia and Afghanistan, a British protectorate. Russian and Afghan troops built forts near each other, and on March 30th, Russian forces attacked Afghan positions at Kushka. Britain was outraged, and for a brief moment it appeared that the two greatest empires in the world might go to war over this patch of land. But diplomacy prevailed. The Afghan ruler urged the two sides to negotiate, and a compromise was reached. Russia would keep Kushka while Br.